Hello, everybody, and welcome to the next session here. And I know we had some technical difficulties beforehand, but I'm really happy to introduce our friend from Australia, Rafe Britton, who's going to be doing some storytelling for us. So without further ado, here's Rafe.
G'day everyone, how's it going? My name's Rafe Britton. I'm a lubrication engineer and I've been in and around sort of the energy industry for about 12 years now. I have a really big passion for lubricants and lubricant technology. And I think that they're something that's really undervalued in industry. So the more we can do to kind of spread the word and spread everyone's understanding, I think the better off we'll all be. If you want to get a hold of me after this, my LinkedIn details are just down below. I also have a YouTube channel called Lubrication Explained. It does what it says on the tin. I just try and make technology videos about lubricant technology that are accessible to a technical but reasonably wide audience. Anyway, let's get into the presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about storytelling with data. And the tagline is making your valuable data work. So data, everyone talks about it as being the new kind of digital gold, and we have so much of it now. Even just in used oil analysis data, you think that one single sample can probably give you about 50 data points, and we're taking thousands upon thousands of these every day. So really, this is about, there are many, many topics in this field, from data acquisition techniques, making sure that you have a robust sampling program, making sure that people are taking the samples correctly. That's all extremely important. Making sure that you are sending the samples to a reputable lab. That's obviously very important too. Understanding everything. So there are so many aspects and pieces of this puzzle. And the bit that I want to address is right at the end of the pipeline. So you've done everything correctly. You have a really robust program going on. It's how do you take all of that data, of which there could be a lot, and how do you distill it down into insights that are actionable? So generally what we're having to do is take all this data to a decision maker. Maybe it's a procurement specialist. Maybe it's the maintenance superintendent. But generally, they're not going to be as familiar with lubricant technology as us. And so we're having to take all this data to them and make it understandable. So there's a couple of techniques that we can use for this, and I'm going to center on three. So there's data visualization, which is all the science around kind of simplifying down the data. There's some really, really good literature on this, and I don't claim to be a specialist, but specifically like the Silicon Valley types have really nailed this. Then we want to get into the demonstration aspect, and this is where we can distinguish ourselves from regular data analysts, because as lubricant technologists, we can actually explain the data, explain cause and effect. And I think that makes it much more effective when we're explaining the data. And the final piece of the puzzle is narration. So you might have heard of this concept of creating a story with the data. And the reason we want to do that is because stories are just more memorable and they're more convincing. And so if we can craft a story around the data that we have, when we present to management, it will make it much easier for them to make a decision. So let's get started with point number one, which is data visualization. What I'm going to do over the course of this presentation is run you through an example. So I'm going to use the example of a gas engine customer that's running on sour gas. Now I'm familiar that most of the people in this audience are probably coming from a turbo machinery background, but hopefully all the concepts are going to be quite familiar to you. So this gas engine customer was running a trial over the course of about 18 months to determine if there was anything that they could do in terms of increasing oil drains and increasing oil life. Now, the one thing that I kind of take away from this is that used oil analysis data by itself is not particularly helpful. So what I'm showing on screen here is typically how it would show up in a used oil analysis report, right? You'd have all your data in tables, and then somewhere on the sheet, you would have trend lines. Now, I'm not trying to criticize the testing companies here, because they need to come up with a pro forma that you can understand at a glance. And so every report needs to look exactly the same so that you can look for those markers every single report. But it's not that helpful when we want to do deeper analysis. So if you just take a look here at the data that they have, the dates between the first and the second sample, 9 days. Second and third sample, 9 days. But third and fourth sample, 3 days. And then fourth and fifth sample was 10 days. So already the trend line isn't really representative of the real world, because we're showing that the samples are equidistant from each other when in time, and therefore in engine hours, they're actually, some of them are closer together than others. So already it's kind of misleading. It can be even more misleading when there's more data. So this is the timeline over 18 months, which was the trial period. And there are some things that stand out in this data. So if you look, there looks like there's a really long oil drain in the middle, and that's purely based on the oxidation numbers, right? We expect the oxidation to go up in time. But that's a little bit confused by the TBN data, right? So it looks like there were potentially 3 drains in that period, because we get periods where the TBN goes up. So that implies that they did an oil change. So now when there's confusion, we have to go back and look at the maintenance records. Was an oil change done, or maybe it just was a big top up? So all of a sudden we have layered on some complexity to this. Now the other layer of complexity is that there were 2 oils in this trial, right? You can see that the starting TBN is relatively low. It's kind of around 6 or 7 at the beginning of the trial, and towards the end of the trial it increases up to 10. So that implies that there are 2 different oils. It makes it even more confusing when there's more data. So this is charts for all 3 of the engines that were involved in the trial. Now this is actually a relatively small trial, only 3 engines. I've run oil drain trials at sites where there were 10 engines running on the trial. I've done used oil analysis data reviews for a powerhouse with 100 engines running on the same gas. So all of a sudden you can see how the volume of data builds really, really quickly. So let's try and fix this a little bit. The first thing that I'm going to do is wipe all of those away and put everything on one chart. So what advantage does this buy us? Well, by putting oil hours as the x-axis, it means that the drains now read left to right, right? So the start of the drain is at 0 hours and the end of the drain is between 1,000 and 1,200 hours. So now all of the data from all of the engines is layered on top of each other on a single page. The next thing that we want to do, and this can be hard to do, is to get really aggressive with the delete button. And we want to get rid of anything that is not going to serve the decision maker. Remember, you should think of the decision maker as kind of your customer in this data journey. So, one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to commit a cardinal sin here, and I'm going to delete the label on the y-axis. Why do I do that? Well, does the decision maker really need to know what units these are in? So long as TAN and TBN are in the same units, then you're fine. The other thing I'll do is delete off the grid lines. So grid lines are really helpful for trying to pinpoint the value of a single data point. But no one is making a decision based off a single data point in this massive sample of data, right? So really, we're more concerned with the overall trend than we are with data points. Then I'll clean this up a little bit. So reduce the axes down because there was no data above 12 for TAN and TBN, and there was no data above 1,200 hours. And that will help us space things out a little bit. I'll move the legend and also fix up the colors a little bit so it's easier to distinguish between the 2 data points. The next thing that we're going to do is acknowledge that while it's helpful to put all these data points on the chart to show the amount of work that we did, knowing each of these data points is actually irrelevant to the overall decision. So I'm going to gray all of these out and highlight the points of interest, which is actually the trend line and the intercept point. And the reason is because this particular site, as you can see from the data, was condemning their oil on the basis of the TAN-TBN crossover method, which is kind of an industry standard, right? And they were doing so at about 1,000 hours. So already I think we've made, some pretty good improvements. We've taken a whole bunch of complex data, which is a little bit difficult to read, very difficult to determine how long the drains are, and it would have taken quite a lot of work for us to get there. And we've been able to condense it down into a single chart where it's very obvious where your eye is supposed to look. So now let's go into step 2, which is demonstration. Let's explain the cause and effect here. So going back to our chart, we can ask ourselves now, do we actually care about the TAN TBN crossover method at this particular site? So, most people would think that TAN and TBN are actually mirror images of each other. And that's because one is the total acid number, the other is the total base number. And I think this preconception comes because we are all familiar with the pH scale from, back in high school. We learned about it, where acids are on one side and bases are on the other. But in lubricants, that's kind of not true, right? Like acids are the byproduct of base oil oxidation. So you build up, carboxylic or organic acids, or they come to us through contamination. In the sour gas, if there's sulfur contamination, then you get sulfuric acid. If there's chlorides, you get hydrochloric acid, etc. Whereas bases come from the TBN additive, right? It's an over-base detergent, and it will deplete along with the other additives. So the base actually helps us reduce the amount of acid that is in our oil. So they're not really the same thing. So it doesn't really make sense to compare them to each other. The analogy I like to give is between iron and zinc. Now, these are two different data points that are measured exactly the same way. They are measured in the same units, right? And you generally see them on the same chart. However, iron is a product of equipment wear or erosion, whereas zinc is an additive, right? It's ZDDP or some similar molecule, and it also depletes along with all the other additives. And so zinc helps us reduce the amount of iron in our samples. Obviously, viscosity being the primary method, but zinc helps. And no one would talk about the zinc-iron crossover, right? No one's condemning their oil on that basis because that would be kind of nonsense. So now that we've established that, we can decouple the TAN and TBN charts into two different charts, right? And so I'll fiddle around with these just to make them a little bit more readable. And now, because we have more space, we can distinguish between the two oils in the trial. But then why do we care about TAN and TBN? Well, we care about TAN because if we have acids in the oil, it raises the corrosive potential and it could damage the bearings, which usually contain, lead, copper, nickel, and tin, which could be susceptible to corrosion. So now if we plot copper versus TAN, what we can see is that actually we're nowhere near the OEM limit. We don't even have a single number above 5 parts per million. And so that suggests that we could actually make huge gains in our oil drains. So that brings us to point number 3, which is narration. And that's, now that we have all these points, how do we create a story around that data? Now, I'd like to give you just an example. So I'm going to run through a very short 5-minute presentation of how I would present all of this data to, let's say, a manager, a maintenance superintendent, or maybe a procurement specialist. All right, so our study has identified the potential to increase our drains by 100%, and that would reduce our costs by about 50%. Now, in order to do this, we're going to have to set aside the OEM limits for TAN and TBN because they require us to use the crossover method. We think that there's good reason to think that that's outdated, although we are going to have to check with legal to talk about our equipment warranties. So the first thing that we did was that we collected 400 samples of over 18 months. So we have a really robust and rich data source, right? We have a lot of data that we've collected. And on the basis of all that data, we've identified that the average oil drain was about 1,000 hours. And as I said, we're using the TAN TBN crossover method, which is an industry standard, right? So as you can see, the crossover of the trend lines is about 1,000 hours. Now, we believe that that rule might not be fit for purpose, or at least maybe it is in industry, but not in our situation. So acids are byproducts of oxidation, whereas bases are additives. And so bases are supposed to reduce acids. Now, if you're not familiar with how over-base detergents work, they are basically molecules that rely on this structure, which has, a hydrophilic or water-attracting polar head, and a hydrophobic non-polar tail that's attracted to the oil. So they form these kind of micellar structures which contain some kind of base. Like a simple one would be like a calcium carbonate on the inside. And the way that they work is that if they encounter a water phase in the oil, that water phase may contain some kind of acid. Let's say, sulfuric acid, because we have sulfur in our gas stream. So as it comes into contact, these the hydrophobic tails are repelled by the water. That opens up the micelle, and that enables the transport of the calcium carbonate or some other base into the water phase, where it can then neutralize the acid. So that's kind of how TBN molecules work. So because the additive and the acid, which you can think of as a contaminant, are not really the same thing, it's a little bit like comparing iron and zinc, right? So zinc is generally considered an additive that helps us reduce the amount of iron, but we don't use the zinc iron crossover method because that just wouldn't make any sense. Where we are concerned about tan is its relationship with copper. So, our main bearings, most of the bearings in the engine contain copper, as do most. Now, I'm going to show a whole bunch of data that's related to copper, but we've analyzed the relationship with lead, tin, nickel as well, and they've all shown the same relationship. So our copper results in this trial are well below the limits that have been prescribed by the OEM. So the OEM actually sets a limit of 15 parts per million, and we don't have a single result from the past 18 months that is over 5 parts per million. Now, if we project out what we could expect if we extended oil life, this is very conservative because we're just using a linear extrapolation. But what you can see is, this extrapolation says that we're not going to hit the OEM limit for copper until we reach a tan of 20. Now, that's unreasonable. We're not actually going to do that. But it suggests that we could double our tan. Again, that's also unreasonable. But our copper levels would still stay remarkably low. The other thing that this tells us from a procurement standpoint is that it doesn't really matter whether we choose oil A or oil B, because we're not achieving anywhere near its potential in either case, right? So this also tells us that because we're not, achieving oil life, putting aside other factors, we should be choosing the cheaper of the two, just because we're not making full use of the lubricant and its additive package. All right, so in summary, our study has identified the potential to increase the drains by a factor of 2, and that would reduce our cost by 50%. We are going to have to set aside the OEM limits, so there could be some danger around warranty considerations. And to make it safe, we would only extend our drains in 100-hour increments. And at the end of each increment change, we would do some corrosion testing. So there's a test called ASTM D130. We can test the lubricant's capacity to resist copper corrosion at that point. And then finally, wherever possible, we'll do a physical bearing inspection to ensure, that we are still continuing to protect engine components. Thanks. All right, so that's how I would kind of do that presentation. I think that makes a relatively simple and convincing case, but I'm also open to feedback. I'm not necessarily the expert on this field. But again, if there's any takeaways from this, I'd really like you to take away those 3 pillars, which the first is making the data simple. In terms of visualizations and charts, simple is better. And remember, not all of the data points need to be on your chart. It's the underlying trend which is going to be most important to the decision maker. Secondly, we can distinguish ourselves from regular data analysts by the fact that we understand the lubricant technology, and we can use that to explain cause and effect. And that explanation leads into the narrative. So to create a story around the data that's memorable and convincing for the decision maker. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation. If you've got questions, I'd love to answer them now. But if you also want to reach out because your business or yourself want to tell more convincing stories with your data, then I'd love to hear from you. Thanks.
Fantastic, Rafe. Thanks so much for that presentation. and I love the way that you look at this from a different perspective. We do have a comment from Steve. He's essentially saying, look, if your graph's not understood within 10 seconds, then it's not a good graph, right? So we talk about displaying this data. Any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. Obviously, that's kind of the premise of the presentation. The one thing I guess I would say on that point is that often the decision makers that you're trying to present to are time poor, right? And they're often making decisions pretty quickly, and that's why you may have done 18 months worth of work and 18 months worth of data collection, but ultimately you're trying to distill it down into basically a 5-minute pitch, right? And trying to get the point across. And you're trying to convey a couple of things. That one is the amount of work that has gone into it to give that person the confidence that you know what you're talking about. But you also don't need to belabor the point of how much work you did. So they just need to know that they can kind of back you and that you know what you're doing. And then if you can get your point across really quickly, using those data visualization techniques, then I think it makes it a pretty convincing case.
Yeah. There was you talked about tan TBN AN acid alkaline base, and that sort of inflection point is the industry standard. And where, let's say, I used to play in the biogas landfill gas engine scene, and you had different OEMs putting well, it's 2.5 plus or minus if there's a change in one, relative to the other, or we don't care about TBN, just focus on acidity. Then you had the oil suppliers coming in with different recommendations and specs, and I know that's not about visualization of the data, but interesting how when you're trying to talk to management or somebody about decision making processes, and you've got all these different recommendations, how do you manage that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think one of the premises, I guess, behind the presentation, and one of the things I'm trying to sort of get out there is just to take a bit of a step back every now and then and question what we're doing. So that the TAN TBN crossover method has been used for probably 50 years now. And I think it's just for people that have been in the industry for a very long time, it's just a given. Like that's just what we do. And we do. And when you ask people, why is it that you do it that way? A lot of people say, well, because the OEM demands it, or the warranty on my engine demands it, right? Is probably the more likely answer. And so the opportunity to question some of those beliefs, I think it can be quite powerful, right? Because one of the things that we did at that site in particular was we had to get the OEMs on board, right? So we showed them that same presentation. We're able to get the OEMs on board to extend the warranty, and yeah, it ended up doubling the oil life, and that obviously has impacts on sustainability and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, I think there are a few areas in lubricants and lubricant technology where we might have to just ask that one step down, a slightly simpler question.
Excellent. We have a question from Rich. So the younger generation, particularly, is very visual. So do you think video can play a role in the presentation of lubricant analysis data effectively, perhaps in a more impactful communication of particular contaminant severity or other uses?
So yes, and that's in some ways part of why I started the YouTube channel, a few months back. We might have lost Josh. So yeah, absolutely, Rich. I think that's a great point. One of the things that I actually started to do with a few of my customers is video presentations. So I started that kind of about 2 years ago because I think there are some people who are old school about it and like to sit down with printed out PowerPoint presentations and all that kind of stuff. But I think there is maybe a new generation of people who are used to learning either in online environments or in videos, and so sometimes it just makes a little bit more sense to people. I think it's maybe a media format which uh, lends itself really well to explanation. And I think the proliferation in YouTube learning content tells you that that video is a pretty powerful medium. I know personally, if I need to do anything around the house, the first place I go to is YouTube to find who has done it in the past and who can explain it visually. So yeah, I think as a media format, video is pretty good. And if I had to make a prediction about what happens in the next 5 to 10 years, I think a lot of business presentations are going to go that way.
So do you foresee, so laboratories, right? The oil labs have, massive volumes of these things, and they automate so much of the reporting on the back end, where they have, if this goes this way, then put this comment in, right?
Yeah.
So this equipment, this oil type, and the result is greater than or less than something, you put this comment in. And they do have, trending and graphs, and they try to group, where metals versus those things. Do you see any type of evolution in the reporting, automated reporting from labs?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the labs are always getting better, and I think the algorithms that they're using, are, constantly being updated and pulling together larger and larger sample data sets is helping to inform some of those comments. The one thing I would say though, and where I think that there is a place for lubrication consultants or some a similar kind of profession, is that the testing labs, they only get to see one part of the whole picture, right? They only get to see the oil sample.
Right.
They can't connect that to any of the operational data on site because they don't have access to it. So knowing what engines are on site, which ones have been recently rebuilt, for example, are there any fluctuations in the fuel gas? Can we tie that data together?
Yeah.
I think that's where there is a place for someone in the middle to do that kind of larger scale data analysis. And one of the things I've actually been looking into recently is my wife's in the healthcare business, and she's actually just finished up her PhD, and I helped her with some of the statistics. And funnily enough, biostatistics for longitudinal studies of things like drugs really lends itself towards oil analysis really well, because it's a repeated, especially in something like engines, it's a repeated measures test, right? So it's like longitudinal data analysis with different patients. So you can reuse a lot of the techniques.
Oh, that's some good insights from a completely different industry.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, so that's all the time we have. Rafe, thank you so much for joining us all the way from Australia. Thanks so much, and we'll see you. Bye.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks, Josh, and thanks everyone for watching.
Cheers.